Throughout the 1990s, the west coast of the United States turned into something like a rolling car museum. Only the exhibits weren't tucked behind velvet ropes or guarded by silent security. They were out in the open, where everything lived louder. Baking under hard California sun, gleaming under streetlights, prowling beneath neon signage, and idling at red lights while the Pacific breeze slipped through cracked windows and half-open moon roofs. The decade carried a special kind of electricity on the road, a humming sense that the right two-door could double as transportation and autobiography. A coupe was a statement you didn't have to explain, because the shape of it did the talking. Long hood, short rear deck, two doors that implied you weren't bringing the whole world along with you. A convertible was the same statement, only louder, because the whole point was that everyone could see you delivering it, hair and sunglasses and all, whether you meant to perform or not. Even when traffic slowed to a crawl, the cars still felt like they were moving with purpose, as if style alone could shove the needle past 60. Early in the decade, the menu of brand new coupes read like a mix of ambition and attitude, as if every automaker had decided the West Coast was the ideal place to test whether style could become a lifestyle. A Ford Probe GT could pull up at a light looking like a concept car that escaped a design studio. Its swooping curves and cockpit vibe promising the future, even if the future was occasionally confusing and the design felt a half step ahead of what people were ready to accept. It had that early 90s optimism baked into it, the idea that the next decade would be sleeker, more aerodynamic, more digital, and probably filled with dashboards that looked like they belonged in science fiction. Across the lane might be a first-generation Acura Integra, sharp and eager, the kind of car that didn't need drama to win respect because it delivered the goods the moment the road got interesting. It wasn't trying to be a poster car in the traditional sense. It was trying to be good, and on the West Coast, that counted for everything. On paper, it wasn't the most intimidating thing on the street, but the West Coast didn't worship paper. It worshipped what worked. It worshipped the feeling of a chassis that listened, the satisfaction of a motor that loved to rev, and the quiet pride of knowing your car could embarrass something flashier when the pavement turned twisty. The Integra's handling, its willingness, and the early signs of an aftermarket universe waiting to explode made it the sort of car a person bought when they wanted to learn the language of speed, one perfectly timed shift at a time. It was a car that encouraged experimentation, wheels, suspension, intake, exhaust, because each small change felt like a new sentence in a story the owner was writing in real time. And in a region where identity often came packaged as an image, that mattered. The right coupe wasn't just what you drove, it was how you introduced yourself to the road, to the parking lot, to the night. Then there were the heavy hitters, the ones that made drivers of ordinary cars suddenly become careful with their lane changes, double-check their mirrors, and reconsider the wisdom of drifting into the fast lane on a whim. These were the coupes that didn't just join the traffic flow, they rearranged it. The Mitsubishi 3000 GT VR4 showed up like Japan's idea of a technological mic drop. Twin turbos, all-wheel drive, and active aero. As if the engineers had decided subtlety was for people who didn't read brochures and didn't appreciate late-night conversations about torque split and wind tunnel testing. It felt like the designers had looked at the era's practical expectations and shrugged, deciding that if a car was going to be expensive, it might as well be complicated in the most thrilling way possible. This was a machine that could look perfectly composed, sitting still, parked at an angle under a streetlight. Its paint catching that particular West Coast glow, and then feel almost unfair once it started moving. The VR4 didn't merely accelerate, it surged, the kind of shove that made passengers go quiet for a second while their brains recalibrated. It was heavy, yes, but it hit its weight with a sense of determination that came from sheer engineering stubbornness. On the West Coast, it belonged to the kinds of drivers who treated empty stretches of freeway like a private test track and considered the Sepulveda Pass less a commute and more a challenge, a place where lane markers were less like rules and more like suggestions. It was the car you'd hear before you saw, a quick burst of spool, a deep exhaust note bouncing off concrete, the flash of taillights disappearing into the next curve as if the driver had an appointment with the horizon. The Honda Prelude, particularly in its sportier trims, built its reputation differently, and that difference mattered in a region where people love to argue about what real performance looked like. It wasn't a wild animal. It was a well-trained athlete, disciplined and precise. with just enough attitude to keep things interesting. It didn't swagger into the scene the way turbo monsters did. It earned its applause by being consistently good at the parts that made driving feel like craft rather than chaos. Its fans talked about steering feel and balance in the same tone other people used for music or film, like they were describing something you had to experience in person to truly understand. They'd mention how it tucked into a corner, how it stayed composed over rough patches of asphalt, how the chassis felt like it was communicating in full sentences instead of vague grunts. Out on canyon roads, it made a persuasive argument that smooth was faster than loud, that speed wasn't only about straight line numbers, but about confidence, rhythm, and the ability to place the car exactly where you wanted it. It was the sort of coupe that rewarded a driver who treated a road like a sequence of choices rather than an opportunity for noise. Meanwhile, the Toyota MR2 Turbo offered its own kind of magic trick, the sort that made people blink twice when they realized it came from the same company that sold perfectly sensible sedans to people who swore they'd never care about cars. Its mid-engine layout and pop-up headlights gave it instant movie star energy, a combination that made it feel like it should have been parked under a velvet cover, not sold to ordinary people with ordinary jobs and ordinary commutes. It sat low, it looked alert, and it carried itself with the kind of compact confidence that suggested it didn't need to be big to be serious. On a West Coast street, it looked exotic enough to start conversations at gas stations and quick enough to end conversations at stoplights. It was the kind of car that could turn a trip to the grocery store into a little performance simply because strangers would glance over, then glance again, trying to place what they were seeing. The MR2 Turbo had that delicious sense of being slightly out of place in the best way, like a sports car that wandered off the set and ended up in a strip mall parking lot. The people who bought them new often did it with a grin, knowing they'd found something that felt rarer than it really was. Something with a layout usually reserved for cars that cost twice as much and came with a badge people bragged about. By 1992, the Lexus SC400 arrived and did something few cars managed to do in that era. It made quiet confidence look like the ultimate flex. Where other coupes tried to be noticed, the SC simply existed with such calm polish that it didn't have to ask for attention. And somehow that made people pay attention even more. Its lines were smooth without being showy, the kind of shape that didn't chase trends so much as glide alongside them, secure in the knowledge that restraint can be its own kind of drama. The whole car seemed designed for people who wanted performance without the noise, power without the tantrum, luxury without the need to announce itself from across 3 lanes. It was the sort of coupe that could glide into a valet line in Malibu or pull up to a meeting in Palo Alto and look equally correct in both places, like it belonged to the scenery no matter what the scenery was. Inside, it had that particular kind of late-century Japanese craftsmanship that felt almost smug, the sense that every switch had been tested 1,000 times and every panel gap had been argued over until it was perfect. And it wasn't just a finished product, it was also a platform, which is how a car becomes more than a car in a place like the West Coast. The SC300, its straight-six sibling, became irresistible to tinkerers and dreamers, the kind of buyers who looked at a clean engine bay and thought, politely, that it could use a little more chaos and a lot more boost. They saw potential in the way other people saw reliability. The SC looked expensive and behaved expensive, but beneath the surface, it had the bones for something wilder, and that contradiction made it irresistible. The idea of swapping in a legendary twin-turbo power plant turned into a local rite, the kind of build story that spread from garage to garage, like folklore. It wasn't just about speed either, though speed was the headline. It was about the audacity of turning a refined luxury coupe into something that could haunt freeways after midnight, about the thrill of combining quiet looks with loud intentions. In the right hands, the SC became the ultimate West Coast trick, a car that could sit peacefully in a parking lot, looking like it belonged outside a nice restaurant, and then, with a turn of the key and a quick rise in RPM, reveal that it belonged somewhere much faster. The Volkswagen Corrado also fit naturally into the era, being sold in the United States between 1990 and 1994. It didn't swagger the way a big V8 did, and it didn't plead for approval with chrome. It was the kind of coupe that looked like it had been designed by someone who preferred a good corner to a good compliment. Someone who valued the feeling of a car rotating neatly through a bend more than the reaction it got parked outside a coffee shop. The Corrado had a seriousness to it that made it seem older than the decade, like it had been built by engineers who were slightly suspicious of trends and decided to do their own thing anyway. On the coast, a Corrado in the right hands was a quiet flex, the kind that only certain people recognized immediately. It wasn't about looking expensive, it was about looking deliberate. The stance would be tidy, not slammed into oblivion, just enough to suggest the owner knew what alignment settings did and had opinions about them. The wheels would be purposeful, chosen less for flash than for fitment, the kind that filled the arches cleanly without turning the ride into a dentist's drill. The brakes might look slightly too serious for a commute, peeking through spokes like a hint that this car had seen more than a gentle crawl down Wilshire. And the driver, more often than not, talked about chassis balance as if it were a personality trait. The way some people talked about astrology or favorite bands, they'd mention turn-in, weight transfer, pedal feel. They'd reference roads by their curves instead of their names. The Corrado wasn't the loudest voice at the meet, but it was the one people remembered later, usually after watching it slip away from the crowd and disappear into a canyon with the calm certainty of a car doing exactly what it was made to do. It didn't need theatrics to be impressive. It earned its reputation in motion, on roads where the scenery blurred and the driver's grin did most of the talking. American coupes and convertibles played their own crucial role in the decade's lineup, and nothing illustrated that better than the Ford Thunderbird. The Thunderbird carried a particular kind of 1990s confidence, big enough to feel substantial, smooth enough to feel relaxed and stylish, in the way only a long-hood American two-door could be, like it had been designed with cruising in mind before anything else. It wasn't chasing the same kind of precision as the European cars because it didn't need to. On West Coast roads, it fit a certain cruising culture perfectly, the kind built on wide lanes, long horizons, and that moment when the freeway finally opens up and the car can settle into a steady, unbothered stride, it didn't need hair trigger steering to be fun, because it was built for a different kind of joy. The joy of rolling, of gliding, of making the freeway feel like a boulevard when the traffic finally loosened its grip. The Thunderbird was the car for the driver who wanted to float down the 10, with the radio turned up and the sunset happening right on schedule. A driver who didn't measure the experience in lap times, but in vibes. It had a hint of muscle, a hint of luxury, and a big dose of personality, which in the 1990s was often the whole point. It was the sort of car that looked especially right under neon lights, the kind that could make a late-night fuel stop feel like a scene, and the kind that reminded everyone that the West Coast was always as much about the cruise as it was about the destination. Of course, the West Coast wasn't a single mood, it was a collage. That was the whole point. For every driver who wanted crisp German edges and an understated profile, there was someone who wanted to float. Someone who believed the best coupe wasn't the one that attacked a corner, but the one that made the freeway feel like a private boulevard. That's where the Cadillac Eldorado lived. Big, dramatic, and unbothered by anyone else's idea of restraint. In a decade where imported precision was worshipped in parking lots, and on early car forums, the Eldorado kept its chin up and its hood long, refusing to apologize for being unapologetically American. It didn't try to be small or sharp. It was confident in its own philosophy. Comfort first, presence always. As long as you avoided the North Star fitted models during their worst years in the late 90s, the Eldorado had the energy of a car that assumed it would be seen, because it always was, whether it was rolling past a strip of neon-lit storefronts or easing into a space outside a restaurant where the valet glanced up and immediately adjusted his posture. On Sunset Boulevard, it looked perfectly natural. Not as a weapon, but as a moving room, the kind of coupe that could swallow a freeway and still have enough presence left over to dominate a valet line. It carried itself like it had nothing to prove, which paradoxically made it feel even more assertive. The Eldorado wasn't pretending to be a lightweight athlete. It wasn't asking permission to take up space. It was leaning into the American tradition of comfort served with confidence. The automotive equivalent of sunglasses indoors. The kind worn not to look cool, but to signal that looking cool is the baseline expectation. Inside, it offered that particular domestic sense of ease, the feeling that the cabin had been designed around the driver's desire to arrive unwrinkled and unbothered. It was the sort of coupe that made a long night out feel smoother simply by existing, a rolling buffer between the driver and the world. The Eldorado didn't need to win a canyon race to earn respect. It won a different contest entirely. It made cruising feel like an art form, and on the West Coast, cruising was never just transportation. It was theater. Lincoln took a different approach to the same American question: how to make a big coupe feel like a personal statement rather than a compromise. The Mark VIII arrived with a smoother, more futuristic attitude, and it wore the 1990s like it had been tailored for them. As if someone at Lincoln had decided the decade deserved a grand touring coupe with a little sci-fi baked into its silhouette. It wasn't flashy in the traditional sense, but it had a quiet drama to it, especially at night. The later versions, especially the ones with that distinctive rear lighting that looked like it had been drawn with a neon tube, carried themselves like they belonged under streetlights and overpasses, glowing in traffic, the way an arcade sign glowed in the corner of a strip mall. On the West Coast, that mattered. This was a region where a car's silhouette at dusk could be as important as its numbers on paper, where the way a shape moved through sodium streetlight could decide whether it felt ordinary or unforgettable. The Mark VIII didn't need to hustle to feel fast. It just needed to glide, which it did, down the 10, up the 405, through the slow choreography of evening traffic, where a composed, comfortable coupe could feel like its own kind of victory. It didn't have to announce itself with noise. It made its point with smoothness. There was something satisfying about how it seemed to carry speed rather than chase it. The way it could settle into a lane and turn the whole commute into a gentle, controlled drift through the city's bloodstream. It was a car for people who appreciated the idea of performance but didn't want their performance delivered like a punchline. They wanted it wrapped in soft seats and a steady ride, the sort of motion that made the radio sound better and the night air feel more intentional. The Mark VIII was for the driver who liked the feeling of capability without the need for constant proof. Someone who could enjoy the freeway as a long, luminous ribbon instead of a battlefield. In a decade obsessed with statement pieces, it made its statement in a different dialect. Not loud, not shy, just assured, as if it had already decided it belonged there and saw no reason to debate it. As it turned out, both the Eldorado and the Mark VIII would be the last of these distinguished American lines, the final carryovers of a simpler time when the divisions and classifications of luxury motoring in the United States were purely in favor of the domestic market. The Lincoln would meet its end first during the summer of 1998, while the Eldorado would soldier on until 2002, bringing a conclusion to what could be described as the classic era of American cars as SUVs and sports-oriented supercharged coupes dominated the public consciousness and, more importantly, their wallets. But down below, the big hitters at Lincoln and Cadillac, the Eagle Talon wore its attitude like a fresh pair of sneakers that were definitely not meant to stay clean, the kind a person bought with good intentions and then immediately took somewhere dusty on purpose. It was one of those cars that could look like a commuter on Monday and a problem on Friday, a shape that somehow managed to read as responsible in daylight and suspicious after dark. In all-wheel drive turbo form, it hinted at physics-breaking traction and late-night bravado, a machine built for the kind of freeway on-ramp that felt like a stage, where the driver could audition for a starring role with nothing but boost and confidence. It didn't have to be the fanciest thing at the meet in a strip mall lot because it had something more valuable than leather: credibility. The Talon's whole vibe suggested a person who knew where the industrial parks were, knew which gas stations stayed open late, and knew exactly how long it took for a friend to show up with tools in a backpack and an expression that said, "This should only take an hour," even though everyone understood that was a polite lie. A Talon could be mildly stock and still look like it had plans, like it was one impulsive paycheck away from becoming something louder and faster. It could also be modified within an inch of its warranty, humming with the kind of upgrades that were explained with phrases like, "It's not done yet," and "I'm waiting on parts," as if the car itself was a constantly evolving project rather than a finished purchase. The West Coast treated cars like ongoing conversations, and the Talon was fluent. There was always some new tweak to debate, a little more boost, a slightly better intercooler, a different exhaust note that sounded just aggressive enough without crossing into neighbor complaint territory. Its owners learned the delicate choreography of being fast and being ready, of leaving just enough room in the budget for premium fuel and just enough room in the trunk for regrets. West Coast kids learned early that the Talon's real magic wasn't only speed, but possibility. It was a gateway car, the kind that taught a driver how quickly just an intake turned into a full personality shift, where a casual interest in cars became a full-blown identity, complete with favorite brands, favorite forums, and the ability to spot another turbo car by sound from half a parking lot away. If the Talon was the scrappy overachiever, the Mazda RX-7 was the exotic friend who made everyone else feel slightly underdressed, the one who showed up to a casual hangout looking like they just stepped out of a magazine shoot. The third-generation RX-7, low, wide, and determined to look like it belonged under neon, gave the West Coast something rare, a car that felt imported not just from Japan, but from a future where everything was smoother, faster, and a little more dangerous. It didn't sound like anything else when it came on boost, and it didn't behave like anything else when pushed, because the rotary engine had its own logic and its own mood. The RX-7 was the kind of car that could turn an ordinary drive into an event. Even at idle, it seemed impatient, like it was politely waiting for the driver to stop wasting time and find an open stretch of road. The rotary engine invited devotion and punished carelessness, which only made it more romantic. It asked for attention the way a high-maintenance masterpiece does, the way something beautiful and complicated demands to be understood on its own terms. Drivers who chose an RX-7 weren't looking for good enough. They were looking for a story they could tell later, preferably while gesturing vaguely toward an engine bay and saying, with the calm of someone who has accepted their fate, that rotary ownership was a lifestyle. It was the kind of statement that sounded like pride, warning, and a strange form of joy all at once. The RX-7 owner often carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew their car was special, even if it occasionally behaved like it had its own opinions about the laws of thermodynamics. On the West Coast, that lifestyle often unfolded in motion, because a car like that begged to be driven, not simply parked and admired. The RX-7 was at home on canyon roads above Malibu, where the curves demanded commitment and rewarded courage, where the line between skill and foolishness could be as thin as a painted stripe. It looked equally natural idling in Glendale under fluorescent lights, its paint reflecting the storefront glow as if it was quietly waiting for the next scene to begin. And the scene always did begin, because someone always wanted to hear it rev again, to watch it leave again, to pretend the rules of heat and fuel and practicality didn't apply. The RX-7 didn't just occupy space in traffic, it performed, even when it was doing nothing. People glanced over at stoplights. People craned their necks in parking lots. People remembered the shape, the stance, the promise. Even when the model disappeared from U.S. showrooms mid-decade, it didn't vanish from the culture. It simply became the kind of car people spoke about with a wistful edge, like a favorite band that broke up too soon. It became myth-friendly. Every story about an RX-7 was slightly larger than the moment itself. It was always faster, always cleaner, always more dramatic in retrospect. That was part of the charm. The RX-7 didn't have to be common to be influential. It only had to be unforgettable. While the RX-7 represented a kind of sharp-edged glamour, the Toyota Celica was the dependable friend who still managed to dress well, the one who never missed a plan and still looked good showing up. The Celica didn't need to be the loudest or the fastest to be everywhere. And on the West Coast, it was everywhere in the way sunshine is everywhere, constant and taken for granted until it's suddenly missing. It moved through the decade with the confidence of something that knew it would start every morning, even after a long night, even after a week of procrastinated oil changes and questionable gas station snacks for dinner. In a region that loved to modify cars into rolling mood boards, the Celica offered a blank canvas without the anxiety. It could be tastefully customized or gloriously overdone, and somehow it still looked like it belonged, like it was in on the joke. Its owners could add wheels, stereos, exhausts, spoilers that tried their best to become wings, and body kits that occasionally looked like they were designed during a sugar rush. Some Celicas became neat little street cars, clean and simple, lowered just enough to look intentional. Others became loud declarations, painted in colors that demanded attention, wearing graphics that seemed to exist purely to start conversations at gas pumps. And if the modifications didn't work out, the Celica would still get them home. That reliability mattered in a place where enthusiasm sometimes outran experience. It was sporty without being fragile, stylish without being precious, and common without being invisible. An impressive trick in a place where attention was practically a currency, and the competition for it never took a day off. The Celica's real power was that it welcomed all kinds of drivers. A college student could run it with a backpack in the back seat and an overworked part-time job in the front, the car doubling as transportation and therapy. A young professional could keep it clean, waxed, and just subtle enough to look responsible, while still enjoying the fact that it was a coupe and not another beige appliance. It showed up on coastal drives, on commutes, and in parking lots where the ocean air salted everything equally, turning shiny metal matte and teaching owners the eternal lesson that California sun could be both a gift and a slow, relentless paint fader. The Celica didn't beg to be worshipped. It asked to be enjoyed, which is why it fit the West Coast so well. It was the kind of car that could be part of a person's life without demanding that the person reorganize their entire life around it. And that practicality, on a coast famous for its dreams, was its own kind of quiet luxury. Meanwhile, the European coupes played their own game, one built on ambition, expense, and the kind of engineering pride that came with a faint whiff of superiority. BMW's 8 Series, especially the V12-powered versions, looked like a sci-fi prop that somehow got a license plate, as if it had rolled off a soundstage and onto Sunset Boulevard without changing its costume. It had pop-up headlights, sculpted lines, and a low, sleek shape that made it appear perpetually in motion even while parked. Its price tag suggested its natural habitat was a gated driveway, a private garage, a place where someone else worried about the cost of tires. Seeing one on the street felt like spotting a rare animal outside its usual territory. They were the sort of machines that looked perfectly at home under valet lights, idling with barely a tremor, as if even the engine refused to look stressed. The most exclusive versions felt less like cars and more like private lounges that happened to have engines, their cabins designed to make the outside world feel optional. They weren't trying to impress other drivers. They were trying to make arriving look inevitable, like the destination had been expecting them all along. Even in traffic, they carried themselves like they had a schedule, and the city would eventually accommodate it. Never too far away from BMW's place in America sat Porsche and its 928, which carried itself like a sophisticated heavyweight who had nothing left to prove and also didn't particularly care who noticed. The 928 was a long, assured monologue delivered in a low voice, the kind that makes everyone else in the room quiet down without being asked. It had the unmistakable vibe of a grand tourer, built for crossing long stretches of highway, with the kind of effortlessness that made distance seem rude for even trying. It didn't just cover miles, it erased them. On West Coast roads, it felt like the car for someone who liked the idea of performance, but liked comfort almost as much, and liked being underestimated more than either. The 928 was a reminder that speed didn't always have to arrive as noise and drama. It could arrive as composure. It was the kind of coupe that would glide through a coastal town at a calm pace, then surge up an on-ramp with the quiet authority of someone who knows exactly where the power is stored and doesn't feel the need to wave it around. The 928 didn't beg for attention the way some flashier cars did, with wings and vents and an obvious hunger to be photographed. It didn't need to. It simply arrived with a V8's calm authority and the sort of presence that said, without speaking, that it had been expensive long enough to be confident about it. It looked like it had been built to live at high speed, but not in a hurry, and that contradiction was part of its charm. Nearby in Porsche's lineup, the 968 played a different role. The precise, disciplined athlete who shows up early, warms up properly, and still somehow has time to look good in photos. It didn't swagger. It didn't posture. It simply did the work, and it did it with an unbothered kind of competence that made enthusiasts lean in closer. It was the kind of coupe that appealed to a driver who enjoyed the process of driving as much as the outcome. Someone who cared about how a car communicated through the wheel, the seat, and the pedals. West Coast enthusiasts loved cars that could turn a random Tuesday into a canyon excuse. And the 968's balance made it feel like a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. It didn't overwhelm a road. It traced it. It made a driver pay attention to details, entry speed, weight transfer, the exact moment the grip settled in, without ever feeling like homework. It didn't demand drama. It rewarded attention. It had the special talent of making an ordinary stretch of pavement feel like a private proving ground. In a decade when some cars were getting heavier, more complicated, and more distracted by luxury, the 968 held onto a cleaner, more mechanical kind of fun, like it had politely declined the invitation to become a rolling living room. It belonged to that rare category of machines that didn't just get you somewhere. They made you more aware of the act of getting there. And with that, we end part one of this little journey through the two-door dream cars of the 1990s West Coast. Next time, we'll be diving into something a little more exotic, climbing the ladder further to the very top of what you could afford if you had truly made it. Catch you next time.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 1 9 on X, we're here just for you.